We'll just wait till about 6:05 before we start the presentation, just to allow people to enter it. We'll just give it a couple of more minutes and then we'll crack into the presentation. Okay, well, by my time, it's 6:05, so welcome everybody. This is a webinar of some very significant planning changes on the way for Waipā. So next slide, please. My name is Wayne Allen, and I'm Council's Group Manager of District Growth and Regulatory Services. Tonight, we're aiming to do two things. Firstly, just give you an overview of some really complex changes that have been forced upon us. Changes that we think have the potential to fundamentally change parts of Cambridge, Te Awamutu and Kiki's residential areas. And secondly, most importantly, we want to answer as many questions as possible about those changes. I'll talk a bit about that in a minute, but I did want to cover off some housekeeping matters first. Everybody, apart from the presenters on tonight's webinar, will be muted. Otherwise, it is simply impossible to hear people. Please be aware that tonight's webinar is being recorded and a link will go into our website tomorrow. And questions you submit in the chat during the webinar are not private, so they are available on the webinar as well, on the website as well. In terms of the questions, we've been encouraging people to send in questions early, and we've already received some, so thank you for those that have submitted. And during tonight's webinar, you're welcome to ask more using the chat function. So let's go to the next slide. But before we start, I did want to reiterate a couple of things. There's a lot of information about this issue already on our website, including a whole series of questions and answers that we're continually adding to. So please take a note of the web address above, www.waipādc.govt.nz/plan change26. And jump in if you already haven't, and have a good look around. Secondly, we've done a brochure information, and we've sent that out to folk in the mail. It's also on our website. So if If you haven't got a copy, go onto the website and download a copy if you wish, or just have a look. And thirdly, take a note of the email, districtplan@waipādc.govt.nz. If at the end of the webinar you have more questions, send them here and they'll be picked up by the team. So speaking of the team, let's go to the next slide. So we've got 4 people on hand tonight, including myself, to help answer questions. Include Tony Quickfor, our Manager of District Plan and Growth, who is right across all the complex legal and technical and process issues. Joe Cook-Munro, who has really had the really difficult job of writing the proposed Plan Change 26, so knows it pretty well. And Tony Coots, our Principal Engineer. He'll be able to answer questions in relation to infrastructural issues. Behind the scenes, we've also got people collating questions and making sure this webinar runs smoothly. We've allowed about an hour for the webinar, but can be a bit flexible. So let's just get into it. So firstly, I guess change is coming. New laws are forcing changes to our Waipā District Plan. This is the Resource Management Enabling Housing Supply and Other Matters Amendment Act 2021. That piece of legislation came into effect towards the end of last year. It requires councils like ourselves, being a Tier 1 growth councils, to notify a plan change by August of this year. Didn't give us a lot of much time, and there've been a number of councils that have sought extensions to getting their plan changes notified. Our plan change is plan change number 26. These new laws aim to address the national housing crisis and apply to big growth cities, including cities such as Auckland, Christchurch, Wellington, Hamilton, Rotorua and Tauranga, plus some other small towns such as what Waipā has, Cambridge, Te Awamutu and Kiki. We are caught up in these law changes, specifically, as I say, those towns, Cambridge, Kiki and Te Awamutu. Waipā is part of the Tier 1 Growth Council areas under the National Policy Statement. Just go back a slide, please. That's part of the Urban Development MPS. So that's essentially why we're caught up in these laws. I'd like to emphasise that there are other parts of the district that are not affected. And that includes zones such as the rural zone, our large lot zone, which essentially where there's no wastewater connections, our town belts, our reserves. Karapiro residential zone is not affected. There must be a qualifying of 5,000 people as a threshold to be caught up in these laws, and Cambridge, Kiki and Te Awamutu are part of that. I'd just like to highlight, and this is really an important point, that none of the new medium density residential standards will have legal effect once this plan change has been notified. This is because all of the new medium density residential zones in Cambridge, Kiki and Te Awamutu are proposed to have a qualifying matter overlay over them. I'll talk a little bit more about this qualifying matters shortly. So at the time of the plan change notification, nothing will change in terms of what is a permitted activity. The current district plan provisions will continue to apply. So if people want to build 3 houses per site, 3 stories high, they'll need a resource consent. They want to build 1.5 metres from the front boundary or 1 metres from the side boundaries, they'll need a resource consent until this plan change has reached at least the point of decisions. Next slide, please. So what does all this mean in practical terms? There is a national housing shortage. The changes aim to see more houses built faster in high growth areas. Central government wants landowners to be able to build 3 houses up to 3 stories high to a maximum height of 11 metres without the need for resource consent. There are no minimum sizes for residential subdivisions within certain conditions. And as I've sort of alluded to, some of the other controls that were in the legislation provide for road setbacks of 1.5 metres from the front boundary, side yard setbacks of 1 metre, site coverage of 50% maximum, impermeable surfaces of 60% maximum, height of 11 metres as I've indicated, a more permissive height to boundary recession plane of 60 degrees measured at 4 metres above ground level, etc. And when this compares to our current district plan provisions, a lot of these, in most cases, are more permissive. So central government are suggesting here in this legislation that the houses can be bigger, higher, and closer to boundaries. Building standards must still be met, so there won't be any substandard housing built. And that's an important point. I'd also just like to comment that council cannot require on-site car parks. That excludes accessible parking for any development, including residential. And that was a government mandate in 2020. So these car parking controls have already been removed from the district plan. Next slide, please. So I talked earlier about qualifying matters. This is more and new resource management technical language being used in this legislation. So let me explain this a little bit more. So qualifying matters are matters which allow for modifications to the new planning rules. The legislation does not allow for an area to be excluded from the medium density residential standards. That is why we've created a new section 2A medium density residential zone over the residential areas of Cambridge, Te Awamutu and Kiki. Councils can add qualifying matters, but there must be very robust justification. In essence, the new planning rules will apply unless there is very specific and robust reasons for them not to. And we think in Waipā, there are sufficient reasons to not apply the medium density residential standards in our residential zones through these qualifying matters. So let's look at these qualifying matters now. Next slide, please. As discussed, we legally have to notify a plan change to recognise the new legislation. Our proposed plan change at Waipā is plan change 26. It recognises the vision and strategy for the Waikato River. That is a qualifying matter. In our view, and we've had reports in this regard, without the right infrastructure, particularly for stormwater and wastewater, an increase in housing has the potential to adversely affect the Waikato River and other bodies in the Waikato catchment. We also acknowledge that Waipā's current infrastructure, things like our roads, our pipes, do not have the capacity to cope with a huge and fast increase in housing, certainly not without significant investment. We believe Waipā should only have 2 houses, not 3 under this legislation, as a permitted activity on each site, similar to our current district plan provisions, at least until the qualifying matters have been resolved. Financial contributions from developers are the primary tool to fund the unplanned infrastructure under this legislation. And we have updated our financial contribution section as part of this plan change. However, this has added another complication or level of complexity, as we normally take development contributions under the Local Government Act for developments. Financial contributions are imposed under the Resource Management Act. So any contributions applied on development will need to have regard to both funding mechanisms. Next slide, please. So other issues. Historic heritage and character are both qualifying matters. Retention of our existing character clusters and character streets to be maintained. It is proposed to add new houses into character clusters, so I'll come to that shortly. There are no changes have been proposed to our heritage items under the plan change. Protected trees, heritage and cultural sites, designations in the national grid already in the Waipā District Plan remain protected as existing qualifying matters. Significant natural areas, cultural landscapes, e.g. the Waikato River, and public open spaces remain protected. Next slide, please. So other changes. As I identified, we've added an additional 91 houses as character houses into new or existing character cluster areas. We've sent separate letters to those landowners affected. Essentially, for those character houses, a restricted discretionary resource consent will be required to make changes to the character. They are not listed heritage buildings. And I'd urge any of those landowners, if they've got concerns around that, to lodge a submission on the plan change. There's no amendments have been proposed to the existing heritage schedule in the district plan, which lists historic heritage buildings and items. We have, as discussed, we've made amendments to the existing financial contributions in the district plan. And they'll be able to be charged in respect of residential amenity, example, street trees, and in relation to impacts on the Waikato River on a per bedroom or per dwelling basis. Next slide, please. The changes we anticipate. We may not see wholesale housing intensification fast, but we will see changes to our towns if the medium residential standards are applied. Property owners may add on granny flats or tiny homes without needing resource consent if they meet all the standards. And that's generally commonly known as the second house on the site that you could do under the current district plan. Developers may seek comprehensive multi-storey townhouse developments. Developers will be expected to pay for infrastructure upgrades, but we do not expect this to cover the entire cost. It is very difficult to quantify the impact on infrastructure right across the residential network. The intensification changes are expected to drive costs for ratepayers. Next slide, please. So in terms of next steps, submissions that seek to amend or delete the new density standards will be considered out of scope. This is not usual practice, but you can lodge submissions on the qualifying matters. So that's as per the legislation. Submissions will be considered by independent hearing commissioners mid-2023. In fact, there will be directions from the chair of the independent hearings panel put up on our website indicating the process and timeframes to consider the submissions to the plan change. And we understand that hearings on the plan change will be around May, June of next year to hear the actual submissions. Commissioners will then make recommendations to the council, and council will decide whether it accepts or rejects the recommendations of the commissioners. If council rejects the recommendations, then the Minister for Environment will make the final decision. New rules will come into effect from the date of decisions. We don't have an exact date at this time, but it could be late 2023, early 2024. So, as I said earlier, the standards don't have any effect until at least the decisions will come out. So that gives you an indication of when the legal effect of the plan change could possibly be realised. Next slide, please. How to make a submission. So submissions can be made at www.waipādc.govt.nz/have-your-say. It's also important to note that government has funded a free independent Friend of Submitter service to provide advice on the submission process. The Friend of Submitter cannot write submissions, but can advise on the process. If you need assistance on the submission process, please contact Friend of the Submitter. And the phone number of the Friend of the Submitter is there, 027 315 0177. And the email, which is pc26@kineticenvironmental.co.nz. Submissions on the plan change close 5 p.m. Friday, 30 September 2022. And next slide, and I think that's essentially the presentation. It's question time. So fairly high level presentation as you can see, but we'll get into some questions, and we've already got a few, so just let's move into the questions. I'm going to rely on my team to respond, so if you do get a call up, can you just turn your camera on and respond to the question, please? So the first question was about a property owner can build a 3x3 building without land use consent. On the other hand, council can regulate aspects of the building's design as set out in the standards. Isn't this a conflict? So Joe, perhaps I can throw this one to you.
Okay. So while the new standards are three-story houses, the standards also contain building height standards, building density standards, site coverage standards, and outdoor living space and outdoor space standards. So we can't control a lot of the building design standards. A lot of those have actually been defined for us by the standards that have been set by the government. So not really a conflict, it's just a different way of working with things.
Thank you, Joe. Next question. My neighbouring property has potential for future development. Would the new property owners be required to build with the height to boundary restrictions that currently exist? If so, what are the current height to boundary restrictions currently in place to protect privacy and daylight? So I'll just quickly answer those two questions. So the first question, yes, would the new property owners be required to build with the height to boundary restrictions that currently exist? Yes. Currently the MDRS does not apply. So until it does apply, the current district plan remains in force, as I've sort of indicated earlier. And what are the current rules in place? So Waipā, if you look at the height in relation to boundary restrictions, we have sun angles of 45 degrees to the north and 28 degrees to the south, and a 2.7 metre above boundary. Of course, in the proposed legislation, much more flexible regime of 60-degree recession plane from 4 metres above the ground. So the new provisions of the 60-degree recession plane does not have effect until at least we reach a point in the plan change process that allows it to have effect. If you have any further questions of a technical nature, like what's in our current district plan, please contact our consents team. Next question. Why can't housing intensification happen within the new suburbs outside the Cambridge Green Belt? If intensification occurs within the Cambridge Green Belt, I feel it will compromise our vibrant town. I fear it will become another city centre zone that will struggle with fulfilling leases and attracting businesses. I'll throw it to Joe, but I'll just reiterate the point and reinforce the point that the Cambridge town belt, a really important asset for the town, as you know, is not affected by this piece of legislation or by this plan change. It will remain for reserve purposes. Joe, have you got any other comments that you'd like to make?
By law, we had to apply the new standards to the residential zone within Cambridge, Kihi, and Te Awamutu. So we didn't have a choice about whether to apply it on one side of the town belt or the other side of the town belt. If land was zoned residential, we had to apply the new standards to them.
Thanks for that, Joe. Next question. Intensification is most likely to happen on the northern side of Cambridge. Don't you think it would be wise to look at a new sewage treatment plant and land surrounding it at Hautapu? At the same time, utilise the land for growing silage hay to help fund the sewage plant. So I'll pass this on to our infrastructural guru, TC. You want to comment on that?
Yeah, so I suppose when we look at when this plan change was first operative to council to impose, we had a set strategy with where our waste was to go, and that's into our current wastewater treatment plant, which has planned out upgrades for it for a certain level of density. We would look to facilitate wider upgrades at that current location, as having dual treatment centres in different areas does create more carbon emissions in those sorts of schemes. In regards to that as well, it would be a massive capital expenditure to also secure a new wastewater treatment facility, let alone the risk of not getting the consent. So there's a lot of cost risk in providing an additional wastewater treatment facility. In terms of the other comment with regards to utilising the land for growing silage and hay to help fund the sewage plant, it's likely that that would be cost prohibitive and not help fund the rest of that.
Thanks for that, TC. Okay, so that was all the questions on the presentation. We perhaps can leave the presentation slideshow there, and what I've got is 7 or 8 questions that have come through the chat. I'm just looking at my other screen that is coming through, so I'll just read the question. I haven't really had time to look at them, so I might just be throwing them to our team. So the first question that's come through here is, I live in a new subdivision where there are protective covenants. Some of the proposals appear to contravene those covenants. So will our covenants take precedence, or will the new planning rules trump those? My understanding is private covenants are not affected by the plan change. So therefore, the private covenants will remain in force and not be trumped by the plan change. Do I have any sort of different views on that from the team?
No, good summary.
Okay. The next question, when will PC 26 likely become operative? 3, 6, 9 or 12 months after the feedback period closes? As is indicated, you're likely to get hearings mid next year, and then decisions will come out towards the later part of likely next year, or could be early the following year. Just don't know relating to that hearings procedure yet. And then there'll be recommendations back to the council. And if council doesn't agree with those recommendations, it could go to the minister. So that could take some time before the plan change actually becomes fully operative. So I'd bank on somewhere towards the end of next year, early 2024. Next question. As a specific and robust qualifying matter, isn't the 30-year 10.5 million cycle plan in Cambridge, Kiki and Te Awamutu going to be dangerously choked by the car parking side effects of this medium density housing? TC, I don't know if you can respond to that one.
I think it's two parts there, Wayne. So firstly, it's not considered a qualifying matter, the 30-year cycle plan. So that does not fall under the definitions of the matters of national significance or projects of significance, let alone any of our upgrades with any of the roundabouts or any other types of transportation deemed projects. Those were deemed not to be considered national importance. And then, yes, there is severity around the risk of medium density in the car parking without the proper emphasis on street beautification to effectively change those rules. So, yes, there is significant risk of parking now being on the local roads that may impact and create hazards in regards to the cycle paths.
Thanks for that, TC. The next question is about solar panels. What protection does a homeowner have under this legislation if they've invested in solar panels? I guess the question goes to the heart of the changes in the boundary, height in relation to boundary requirements. Well, I guess the first thing is the new MDRS standards going to impact on solar panels on an adjoining property? Is there anybody from the team that might be able to comment on this matter?
Yeah, thanks, Wayne. So what comes to my mind is that, as you mentioned at the moment, the standards don't take effect until it's gone through the decision process. So if someone wanted to build over height at the moment, I guess there's some protection through a resource consent process, but whether shading effects on solar panel are an effect that we could take into account, I'm not sure. So it's a bit of a grey area, to be honest. If the rules are confirmed and I guess 11-metre heights are confirmed as being permitted after it's gone through, then it seems to me there wouldn't be much protection on an existing solar array, but there's still a process to go through before we end up with decisions.
Yeah, thanks for that, TQ. Maybe it's a matter for a submission to be lodged on. The next point, will the town built green zone currently around Cambridge still be protected from any building on it? So I can happily say, yes, it will be still protected. The legislation and the plan change only relates to the residential zones in Cambridge, Te Awamutu and Kiki, not our reserve zone on the Cambridge town belt or any other reserve for that matter. Next question, it's quite a lengthy question. What forward planning has been undertaken by Waipā DC and third parties to supply and augment the current services needed in modern housing that is not just limited to water, stormwater and waste, but includes other services of telecommunications and electrical demand, including the feeder and substation requirements? This is to allow for housing growth as well as the requirements in the general electrification, including those of the transport and healthy homes. What is the current planning being undertaken to ensure all services supplied by council and other bodies will be fit for purpose to cover the 60% uplift in proposed housing by central government? So there's a lot in there, but it's principally infrastructural issues, TC, so hopefully you picked up the nub of the points in that.
I think it comes down to, forward planning is one thing where we have a plan in regards to our Waipā 2050 strategy that was implemented. Another thing is getting a plan change that doubles that density target. So if we get a MPS such as this that doubles that density target, all our forward planning with regards to long-term plans and funding those projects essentially goes out the window. And that's sort of really determined and through those third-party reports we've done that have shown that those infrastructure constraints are there. At this point in time, we're now doing the sort of processing to understand what's the gap in that infrastructure need with a double demand on top of our planned infrastructure. And that's what we're hoping to facilitate in terms of those financial contributions to help overlap that burden. With regards to electrical demand, we have been in touch with Waipā Networks through this process. So they're quite confident in terms of their raw power supply and their sort of high level planning to transfer electricity into the network grid, but they're not too sure in terms of their local infrastructure, the transformers, the HV cables, those types of things. And there's a huge risk in there with their sort of planning and their sort of sourcing of materials, which has long lead-in times. We're talking transformers with 6-month lead-in times, that they might not be equipped in that sort of realm. They are a third-party service and they're not one that council can dictate or operate, but it is important to note that they are trying their best to plan for this as well.
Many thanks for that, TC. Next question was, how did you identify new character clusters, as there appears to be a large number of character areas properties excluded? Was this based around main thoroughfares and not back street properties? Joe, I'll probably throw that one to you.
Yep. Yeah, gotta love character clusters. We hired an independent architect who did basically a drive around every street in Cambridge, Te Awamutu, Kihikihi, and identified houses that he felt should be included in the character clusters. Important to note that the character houses are very separate to the historic heritage houses, and we are only proposing to introduce new character houses through this plan change.
Okay, thanks, Joe. If you just stay on for a moment. The next question is, what if a house has been identified in a new heritage cluster, but has had a significant modern extension added to the rear? Would the house be identified due to the character from the front, or can it be taken out of this cluster?
Important to note that it's not a heritage cluster, it's a character cluster. So if the front of the house still retains its original character, that's why it's been identified as going into a character cluster.
Okay, thanks for that, Joe. The final question I've got here at the moment is, if we're planning to carry out some future work, but prior to the rules changing, will it be assessed based on the proposed qualifying matters? My understanding, as I've indicated, and Tony or Joe, correct me if I'm wrong, but they'll be assessed under the current district plan. The qualifying matters won't take effect until the plan change has reached a point of beyond challenge.
Yes, so at the moment, what has happened is we have gone out and asked for public submissions to the plan change, because all of our residential areas have qualifying matters applied to them. And a qualifying matter is essentially something that enables us to modify the 3 times 3 story houses. We can't exempt, but we can modify. So the qualifying matters need to go to hearing, and then the decision will be made by the panel. So at the moment, if you applied for modification, it would be under the current district plan rules. As we got further along in the process, say at a hearing stage, weighting would be given to the qualifying matters and the provisions in the plan change. And our consent staff would have to do a weighing of both sets of provisions.
Okay, thanks, Joe. The next matter is I've had a look at your map of qualifying matters. There appears to be a zone surrounding the streams where floods are possible. Are these areas exempt from this new law? So Joe, I'll throw that one again to you.
Okay, so what I think you're talking about is our river gully proximity overlay, and it's on both sides of the river, which means the 3 times 3 story houses cannot be applied within that overlay. So it's like another qualifying matter overlay.
That's all the questions that have come through. So if there are questions, perhaps we'll just give it another moment for you to pop those questions in, because I've run out of questions. So we'll just wait for just a moment for people to lodge any further comments in regard to this this plan change. As I said earlier, it's a pretty complex plan change we're having to deal with in very short order, and so it's not easy to explain the technical language that is provided in this legislation. So we're trying to keep it as reasonably high level as possible, but all the plan change documentation is available on the website, including all the supporting documentation that we have done to justify our position in relation to qualifying matters. I do have another question. As I understand it, Kinetic Environmental can't write submissions on behalf. Is that correct? And that is correct. They're there to help you to understand what you can lodge submissions on and help you through the process of the plan change submissions and understanding the hearings process. So they're a government funded I guess, opportunity process to help the submitters through this reasonably technical plan change. So you do use them to help you if you're concerned about how to write submissions or what forms to use or what you can lodge submissions on and what you can't. They're there to help you through the process. Right, another question. What provision have been made to supply adequate water supply, i.e. new reservoirs, taking more water from the rivers? So an infrastructural question, TC, you're not gone yet. Can you respond to that one?
Yes, so I think it's important to note that our current infrastructure constraint modelling that we've done has outlined that each area is covered by the infrastructure constraints, and largely that's to do with water, wastewater and stormwater provisions. So at this point in time, we haven't really gone through the process of upgrading those reservoirs or understanding the financial implications of those upgrades that are necessary, that will necessarily be charged on it as financial contributions. So we're still early in the piece, and it's very hard to quantify what's required to really facilitate this level of growth.
All right, thank you for that. TQ, I'm going to give you a question now. If new townhouses are built, will the towns then comprise mainly renters? As we know, it is already difficult for first-time buyers.
Thanks, Wayne. That is a very good question. So as a council, we've got really no control over the free market, I guess, in terms of when the properties are built, who they're sold to. So all we can do is facilitate and enable that to happen. The short answer is that may well be an outcome if we're getting more houses built, and if developers do want to take the opportunity, albeit they need a resource consent still under the proposal, under the plan change, then I guess part of the government's drive is to drive the prices down by supply. So increase house supply, drive the prices down. It doesn't always quite work like that, and it's very simplistic. But one of the consequences could be that there's more rental opportunity. But we really don't know, and we don't have a lot of control over that, unfortunately.
Thanks for that, TQ. Next question, Joe. Technical question. If the site is 600 metres squared, can it be subdivided under the new plan? Not sure if you have that answer on the top of your head.
Yes, it can, and it is as a controlled activity, which means the consent can't be refused.
Thank you for that. Next question. Right, as this is mandated by central government, what chance does the Waipā District Council team think they have to modify these changes to more suit Waipā and the 50-year plan? So TQ, I think this might be right up your alley. You want to have a stab at that one?
Sure. So I guess we're testing it. We're going to be testing it through the plan change process. As Wayne has said, the plan change proposes that more than 2 houses still require resource consent, which is actually not what the government wanted us to do. But we think we've got sufficient evidence to be able to put that plan change through the process like that. It will be heard by a team of 4 independent hearings commissioners who are also hearing Hamilton's and Waikato District Council's plan changes as well. So we've got some consistency there. So we're hopeful that our plan change stands up and it's robust. We do expect it to be challenged, but that's part of the process of going through that, and that's where the commissioners will be making their recommendations.
Just stay there, TQ. The next question was about intensification and how it's going to affect schools and class sizes. I guess Tony Coots and myself have actually had meetings with the principals of Cambridge just recently, talking about growth and development and the impacts on class sizes, and given them information relating to numbers of dwellings being constructed in our towns, particularly around Cambridge, so that they can plan for their roles for students. But Tony, do you have any sort of other sort of comments that in relation to intensification and the linkage to schools and class sizes throughout our towns?
Yeah, so for any intensification, where it's at scale, and what I mean by that is where there's multiple developments or multiple units being proposed, we do encourage, and in fact, part of our assessment is for the developers to demonstrate to us that they've done sufficient consultation with not only the obviously the infrastructure providers like Waipā Networks, but also Ministry of Education. And often if they haven't done that consultation, we'll reach out and we'll ask the ministry ourselves to confirm that, or we can put in a further information request. So we've got a relatively high level of confidence. We've got some tools there under the plan change as it's proposed.
Thanks for that, TQ. There was a question around fluoride and our recent mandates, but I'm just simply not going to be talking about, or the team talking about, fluoride. It's not within the scope of this discussion, but thanks for the comment. The next question was, I understand that all plans are being expedited. For example, land use open for development in 2035 will now be available if the changes go through. TQ, do you want to have a go at that one?
That one. So I think what that refers to is a previous plan change, which is plan change 13. So we did have what we call, I guess, deferred zones. We still have deferred zones, but we had 2 tiers of them. So one was deferred pre-2035 and post-2035, and that's consistent with the Waipā growth strategy. Plan change 13 removed the deferral on all pre-2035 growth cells. And that was our council's response, I guess, when we're starting to look at the housing demand, the housing crisis. we recognised that there was demand there and that we could open up those pre-2035 growth zones without a big impact on infrastructure. So that's already happened. This plan change doesn't actually affect any of the deferred zones. So the post-2035 deferred zones will still stay deferred.
All right, thank you for that, TQ. I think we've exhausted all our questions. Anything further? Now's your chance. There will be 2 further webinars that we can also respond to questions. So if you've got further thoughts or questions, you can come along to the other 2 webinars that we've got scheduled, which is Monday, August 29 and Thursday, September 1 as well. But all information is on our website. So unless there's anything else, I think that will probably be it. Okay, so no further questions. Thanks very much for your attendance and listening to the presentation. Thanks to the team for being available to respond to questions. We're going to wrap up the presentation now, and as I say, all information's on our website, and we do have 2 further webinars. So if you've got further questions, we'll try and respond to those as well at the next webinars. Thanks very much, everybody.